Hey guys, welcome to the Kane audio vlog and welcome to part 2 of the studio build. This episode, I guess, is kind of carrying on where we left off in the last one. We're going to be looking at electrics, flooring, heating, kind of the more fiddly stuff beyond the structure. So just to recap, in part 1 I covered the landscaping that needed doing because my garden was on a slope, so we covered all of that, and then the foundation and base and everything, and then building the structure, and what available options there were. So for example, I could have got a completely ready prefab off the shelf garden office, which would have been the most expensive option, and then there were questions of, well, if I needed to later soundproof that, how do I go about doing that? And that was all a bit tricky. Then the middle option, which is the option I took, was to get a kind of semi prefab timber structure that I could then expand on and build onto. So a log cabin basically, but one that's in kit form, I guess. And then option 3 was potentially the best outcome, but coronavirus took over and made it kind of impossible. Was to basically build and design everything from scratch. That was also, I mean, it like I say, it would have probably been the best outcome in the long run, but in the short term would have been by far the most stressful. And I know, having built my last studio in an industrial unit, you know, you obsess over tiny little details that end up just not mattering in the end. So those were my options, and I covered that in part 1. If you haven't seen it, watch it now. Part 2, I will basically have a look at, I guess, getting everything plumbed in, I suppose, is really what I did. So starting with the electrics, which I think was probably the most obvious obstacle. It was actually fairly straightforward. I had planned on, so we have, you'll notice, I think it may or may not show up on the videos, to the bottom of the image of the videos, there's actually a fairly extensive patio at the back of the house, with, looking out to the garden, a shed to the very far left, which leads to a driveway with more patio down the side of the house. So my plan all along was to lift up these patio slabs and lay down some steel armor or some steel wire armored cable underneath that, and then up along the side of the house where it can then meet the meter. So that was always the plan. That was fairly straightforward. I mean, I did it all myself. So one caveat I'll put in is I'm not an electrician, but I do have an engineering degree that allowed me to at least understand basic electrics. So I wouldn't recommend anyone without any knowledge to do something like that. But if you do have basic knowledge, it's not the most difficult DIY in the world. So it was a case of wiring in and just being careful with where your neutral block is, for example, because it will just trip. Generally on a meter you'll have a couple of different neutral blocks that you can take a feed from, and they may or may not be slightly off phase. So that's really the only thing to be particularly careful of, other than the fact that you're dealing with live electric cables. But anyway, that's a by the by. So I ran a steel wire armored cable, and the reason for that is, I should hope, fairly self-explanatory. We have squirrels, hedgehogs, badgers, foxes, dogs, cats, whatever in the area. Not only that, we may not live in this property for the rest of our lives. And who knows, in 10 years time, 20 years time, someone may or may not want to dig a hole in the garden, and putting a shovel through a live mains cable is probably not going to be a fun project for them. So making it steel wire armoured is fairly obvious why you'd do that. The shovel will not go through it. Even so, the element that I laid under the garden, I had to dig a trench behind the cabin and along through the garden and under the patio. Even still, I also laid some hose pipe with electrical tape and everything above that, so if someone does at some point in somebody's life go digging in the garden, they'll come across the hose pipe with little flags along it. So hopefully if they do ever come across it, then they should then go, oh, there's a cable down here, I won't dig any further, or I'll at least be more careful. So the steel wire armoured cable, and this is the other thing I probably need to mention, is that while I'm talking about electric coming from the house to the cabin, the actual way that I did all of this was backwards, in that I started with laying out all the electric cables and everything in the cabin and then working my way backwards. Just want to put that in there. So once you reach the cabin, it then hits a consumer unit. This was fairly straightforward. I bought I'll just show you what they look like. I bought a caravan consumer unit. I got a two-way consumer unit that offers a 16 amp and a 6 amp outlet. So the 16 amp is for your main electrics, and then the 6 amp is for your lighting. And then from there, that goes through the cabin wall and into 3-sector trunking. I opted for skirting trunking. You could get, I think they call it dado trunking, which is trunking that goes along the middle of the wall at sort of at equipment height, which I felt like that could be quite handy, but also really ugly. So I figured I'd rather it look a bit nicer in here than having sockets all along the middle of the wall. I also felt that doing that wouldn't have been the best option because, as you can see behind me, I've got acoustic panels up on the walls, and if I had trunking along the middle of the wall, then it's going to be in the way. So there was definitely that to consider. Yeah, the trunking I went for was skirting trunking, so it just kind of sits on the floor and then you can screw it into the wall. There are 3 sections basically in that trunking. So you have one path for your main sockets and your mains electrics. Fairly straightforward. You sink the surface mount sockets into the trunking unit itself in the middle. And then you have a channel below that for any data cables and LAN networking and things like that. And then a channel above for anything like audio cables. So it kind of made sense to have all of that ready in place. Something worth noting, that although I've moved into this studio 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I still haven't actually fixed the trunking to the wall, and I still haven't drilled holes fully into the trunking because I'm still running some final tests, and I didn't want to start drilling holes and feeding cables in and out of it and webbing everything together, knowing that I may or may not want to then move things at a later date. So at the minute, everything is just kind of temporarily placed in position. The other thing to consider is once I had electrics put into place, the next thing I wanted was heating, and I had looked at all sorts of options. Again, having built my last studio in an industrial estate, that place never got really warm, so I ended up, I tried, what did I have there? I had some oil heaters, which were good at heating the air, but the problem was they were fine in the background, but every now and then, every 10 minutes or whatever, they'd click on and off, and then you'd have this tick 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 of everything starting to cool down and shrink. So it's I wouldn't describe oil heaters as noisy, but if you're trying to run a recording environment, they got a bit annoying, especially if you're in a mixed job and it's just that unexpected noise and you think, where's that clicking, and then you hit stop and then you realize, oh, it's your heater. Similarly, the fan heaters, I used those as well in the industrial unit, and they weren't much fun because, first of all, I have sensitive eyes to moving air. A tiny bit of wind and my eyes go red, so that wasn't much fun. But while they're actually pretty good at heating up a room, the moment you switch it off, the room goes cold. So it's one of those things. It doesn't tend to keep it warm very well. And of course, with the, again, running a recording studio, it gets noisy and annoying. So it was kind of tricky. Oh, I also had a gas heater at one point, one of the old highly explosive gas bomb things on wheels. I had one of those in there at one point. Similarly, with the noise of just the ticking, got very annoying. It warmed things up quite well, but it was big, it was bulky, it was ugly. So I went through all sorts of options. I ended up using some infrared panels, which were quite good. They just look like whiteboards, but they heat out through infrared, so they heat objects and not air, basically. And they were quite good. If you sort of aimed it at furniture like a sofa, then the sofa would warm up, and that would just slowly radiate the heat. I've tried lots of options in the past, and I figured, well, since I'm building this place from scratch, I will put in underfloor heating, because it's quiet, it's somewhat efficient. It's not energy efficient necessarily. I don't think it's particularly cheap to run, but I figured if I was building this place with fully insulated timber logs, then it should be able to retain the heat quite well. So while the underfloor heating is probably not hugely expensive, but it's definitely not cheap to get warmed up, I figured it's probably the best option, and it's definitely silent, so that's a good thing. So I don't know if you can see on video, I can't see on the tiny little screen over there, but over here is my thermostat, and it tells me right now that the room right now is 22.6 degrees centigrade. I can have home mode, away mode, hold, temperature, humidity, schedule, holidays, histories. I can set in the electric costs. I can do pretty much everything I want, and I can run that from an app on my phone as well. And at the Amazon Echo I've got over here, so I can say, Alexa, heat up the studio or whatever, and it'll kick in. I've not actually set that up to work, but if I wanted to, I could. So that's quite handy. Certainly being able to do it from the house makes a big difference. So that's the underfloor heating, and then of course the flooring on top of that, fairly straightforward laminate flooring. I don't think there's really anything I can describe about that. And then lighting. Moving on to lighting, there really isn't much I can say about lighting, if I'm honest. You can see the blue neon lights behind me. That's always been a kind of theme for every studio I've ever had. There's always been black, white, and a dash of neon blue since as far back as I can remember. So it was always going to look like this for me. However, in terms of actual overhead lighting, there isn't any. The consumer unit for the cabin, the 6 amp lighting is empty. It doesn't go anywhere at the minute. It's just blanked off. And the reason for that is because, again, I knew that this project was going to be somewhat of an ongoing project. And because of that, I purposefully just didn't want to think about lighting when it was coming to designing everything and getting the interior right and the colors and just placement of furniture and everything. I knew that there may or may not be changes later on, so I felt like I really didn't want to be committing to buying certain types of lights or whatever. So I honestly haven't thought about it. In my last unit I had LED panels in, because I had a false ceiling that I installed in there with acoustic panels, and there were 3 acoustic panels taken out and replaced with LED panels, which were great, way too bright. Unfortunately I got the wrong type. When you put the lights on, it was like being in broad daylight all of a sudden, and that was horrific. So yeah, so I've purposefully left that. I guess I'll probably get some fluorescent tubes, but or that style, I guess, because the beams that you can't see on this video, but basically the beams run this way across the ceiling, so it would be quite easy to just sort of tuck a light behind it or some LED strips or something like that. So it's fairly straightforward. Then of course networking is the other big thing that I had to think about. It was fairly straightforward in that the steel wire armoured cable I laid for the mains electrics. I used a couple of cable ties and just sort of 6-8 inches away from the mains cable ran a LAN cable into the house, and as luck would have it, the positioning of where I was going into the wall with the mains cable, about 300 mil from there, was a TV aerial cable that was already running around the side of the house anyway, so, and going into the house exactly where our router sits. So yeah, so that was quite easy to get into the house and into the router. So it was just a case of building the RJ45 connectors and plugging them in. Router wise, I have an Asus RT86U, I think, in the house, which is a bit of a beast of a router. So I got an Asus RT-AX 56U in here, so I've got Wi-Fi 6 compatible if needs be. I really don't need Wi-Fi 6, but it's there. So yeah, so I'm running, and with the Asus, they have what they call an AI mesh system, so you can basically duplicate broadcasts of the same Wi-Fi. So it's all just one big network across from right at the bottom of the garden to right at the front of the front garden, and we have pretty much perfect signal across the entire property. So yeah, so that's certainly a good thing. Yeah, and anything I need hardwired can be hardwired into the router in this room, or in the house or wherever. It's just pretty straightforward. Yeah, I don't think there's much I can talk about on that front. I mean, it's networking, it's pretty straightforward. Plug it in. And like I said, because I'd got the 2 Asus routers, they kind of work with each other in harmony anyway. So that's pretty straightforward, really. And I would highly recommend, if you're going to have multiple routers trying to broadcast one network, it is worth looking at something like the AI mesh system. I know there's another one called Ubiquity, I think, which is a whole different system, but apparently very, very good. What else do I need to cover? And then finally, I think, is security. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video about my security, but one thing I will say is that it's like Fort Knox. So I have a system, I won't name the brand necessarily, because I feel I probably don't need to, but I have a keypad, a base unit, and contact points on doors, windows, anything movable, motion sensors and cameras, all inside the studio. So with the keypad I can flick it into away mode and everything activates and locks down, and any type of movement or anything, it will notify me on my phone, but also notify a call center dispatch unit that is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, monitoring the system, so they can ring me and confirm whether it's false alarm or whatever, and then dispatch police if needed. So it's nice to have that security. So it's 24/7 monitored, and with police dispatch as an option. I pay a monthly subscription for that. It's really not that expensive, to be honest. I was quite impressed with the pricings, but it's one of those things that's, it's worth paying for, isn't it? Because it's security. And other than that, I have cameras around the outside of the house and motion sensors. And the whole security system inside the studio also has a battery backup system. So if, for example, the electricity was to go off, then it will keep going for another, I think, 48 hours, something like that, on battery. So it's unaffected by power cuts. And second to that, if the internet goes off, it also remains unaffected by that because it has cellular data backup. So I'll still get notifications on my phone, and the dispatch center will still get everything they need. So it's pretty damn secure, I would say. I've opted for things like 4-point locking systems on the doors and window, so it's equivalent to your house front door or whatever. So the security's pretty good in here, I would say. Certainly as good as the house. The other thing to mention, I guess, with the property I live in, I guess you'd also need to be climbing 8-foot high spiked fences, because the driveway and car where I park my car is all secure as well. I think even if somebody wanted to break in here, I mean, first of all, good luck getting past all the cameras. Then second of all, good luck getting past the alarm systems, and then in through the secured doors and locks and everything. And then let's say, for example, you manage to do that. Good luck carrying, I mean, pretty much everything in here weighs a ton. Good luck carrying that over 8-foot high spiked steel fences and gates, with a car parked either side. So I think it's fairly secure in here. But never say never, you've got to be careful, really. And I think that's about it. One more thing to mention on the networking. This was an option I have been looking at and I haven't actually gone ahead with yet, kind of on the security and networking side, I suppose, is the is it network assisted storage, so the NAS drives, basically. So one of the things I'm going to be doing is, because this studio is hardwired to the house as well, I will be putting a hard drive on the router through in the house, and using that as a backup for the computer in here. Sorry about that. Coincidentally, I just took delivery of some more gravel. So I think I was kind of just closing things up there anyway. So networking, I was talking about the NAS drive being an option to have a backup of this computer in the house. So if fire, theft, water damage, whatever was to occur in the studio, then I at the very least have a complete hard drive backup in the house. So I think it kind of makes sense to do that. How easy it is, I don't know, but apparently it's fairly straightforward. I'll find out at some point. But I think that's basically it for networking. Pretty much covered security. Like I say, basically it's Fort Knox, cameras everywhere, motion sensors everywhere. It is what it is. The flooring, heating, I think the underfloor heating's probably a good way. Like I say, it gets to temperature in its own pace, but I think once it gets there, it pretty much stays there. Like I say, we're still in the summer at the minute, so it's 13 degrees outside. It's not particularly cold. When in the winter it'll easily hit 0. So I guess I'll find out how well it maintains the heat in about 6 months' time. But that, my friends, I think is it for this. I think there is one more episode to do on this studio build. Please do comment below, let me know if you need more details or less details. I feel like some of this is just waffle, but I feel like there are I've said this before, there are loads of tutorials on building the structure. There are loads of tutorials on things like retaining walls, or fixing SWA glands onto SWA cable. All the nitty gritty bits and pieces. There are hundreds of tutorials over there, so there's plenty for everyone to choose from. But I feel like most electronic music producers who want to maybe build a studio in their garden probably wouldn't even know to look for SWA cable, for example, the steel wire armored cable, or that it even exists. So I feel like some of my waffle, and I'm sort of skipping over some stuff, but trying to mention as much stuff as I can so that it's hopefully helpful to some of you out there. Like I say, looking ahead, I think there's one more part to do, which is probably going to be really where the money is for you guys that follow this channel. It's going to be soundproofing, which there isn't any, so spoiler alert there. But more importantly then, acoustic treatment, dealing with the room shape, the room size, and equipment placement, things like that, and running a few tests just to kind of again, I don't want to just gloss over these things, but at the same time I don't want to obsess over tiny little details that are really only going to be specific to me. So hopefully what I'll do is I'll put together a video on just what software I'm using, what equipment I'm using, and roughly what the goal is and how I get to achieve that, if I get to achieve that. And then that's pretty much it for getting us up to scratch to where I am today. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've had some useful information from this, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.